I think I was about 17 when I first read Leigh Bardugo's Shadow and Bone, and after approximately the seventh mention of Kefta, I just about chucked the book across my room, but I couldn't, given it was a library borrow. However, prior to that, I had read and, admittedly, more or less enjoyed The Six of Crows, though I was severely disinterested in its sequel and never got around to it. By the end of this essay, I'm hoping you'll understand why I never will, because that is where our story begins. While my teenage self really liked the vibe of Kaz, who I now cringe at as an adult,
that's a child,
and I wanted nothing more than for Nina to stick a shiv into Matthias, one character who captivated my ideological mind was Inej. Fun fact, I only recently found out that that is apparently the pronunciation of her name. Since she was from Ravka, Bardugo's fancy Russia ill, I thought her name was supposed to be Inyy, as in frost or rime in Russian, which is transliterated exactly as her name is spelled in text. Something tells me that that may have been precisely the intention, Anglophones just couldn't be bothered. What interested me most was her, Inej's, culture, her ethnic group named Suli. It interested me because I recognized it immediately for what its coding, whether subconsciously or actively intended, was. Ruska Roma, Russian Romani. And yet, people weren't really talking about it. Obviously, they were, but far from prominently or seriously enough for my liking. I do a lot of ethnic minority activism work, and Romani people are objectively the most marginalized group of people worldwide. In Russia, absolutely so. Romaphobia and anti-Romani violence are prolific, and erasure is damn near a given. Leigh Bardugo, through her books, contributes to century-old violence against Romani people. So, let's discuss. Disclaimers are a must here. The most important being that I am what Romani people call a gaji. That means I am non-Romani. That translation specifically means non-Romani woman. The gender-neutral gaji isn't actually grammatically correct as a singular in Romanlichiv, the Romani language. Keep in mind, though, that I do not identify as a woman. And I am very non-Romani. I've done extensive genealogy for myself, and there is zilch nada for even the general region. The closest we got was Tajikistan, and even that is way off. With that, I do not have personal lived experiences of Romani people. I grew up around Ruskarama as I was raised in the hinterlands, like actual hinterlands. I'm talking no plumbing, no running water, no public transport, no church, sometimes no electricity kind of hinterlands. And even though I knew, and still know, a little Haladitka, Russian Romani language, I am still very much an outsider, and everything I say here should be received with that in mind. This is not going to be like my anti-Russian and anti-Swana Orientalism videos, wherein I had personal stock as a mixed Baltoslav Anatolian, Central Asian, whatever. I have been educating myself on and heavily participating in Romani civil rights advocacy for years, but I am not an authority. I'm like barely out of my teens also. This isn't going to be surface level, but it's not going to be especially deep waters either, as I have a thesis. And before we do go down in the submarine, you'll probably hear me flip-flopping between different pronunciations of the same word several times. I will be, at least on occasion, anglicizing the Haladitka terminology I know. At other times, I'll be using said Haladitka terminology in the raw. The Romani language group is extremely vast and diverse, and pronunciation from one Romani language won't necessarily be transposable onto another. Romani isn't technically even the correct pronunciation, it's Romani. However, I'm also working around the language of this essay, which is English, so I will also be, at times, forced to opt for quote-unquote incorrect pronunciation in order to make what I'm saying flow. Keep that caveat in mind also as we proceed, which we're doing right now. Encompassing a vast number of subgroups and communities, the Romani people are Indo-Aryans, suggested through linguistic and genetic evidence to originate from the ancient ancestral South Indian of the Indian subcontinent. While Romale are thought to originate in central and western India, they saw a migration to and eventual ethnogenesis in the northwest, particularly the Rajasthan and Punjab regions. I highly recommend watching this video about the origins of Romale. It's short but informative and presented by a Romani person. The Romani westward migration from northern Hindūstān to Europe is speculated to have occurred circa 1000 CE, with their arrival in Europe marked between the 13th and 14th centuries, whilst their migrations to the United States occurred in approximately the 19th century. The two prevailing theories as to the exodus of Romale from India are 1. Displacement due to the invasion of northern India by Mahmud of Ghazni, and 2. Caste-based oppression. As already alluded to, the Romani language, or Roman Lichib, is what's called a macro language. Think of it almost as an umbrella term, encompassing multiple dialects and varieties. Some of these include Lomavren, Calderaș, Zambazi, Lovari, and, of course, Haladitka, the language of the Ruscar Roma. There is a word by which you might better know Romani people. I do not and will not say that word, but I will place its definition here with the word censored but legible. Trigger warning. This word is a racial slur, derived from Egyptian, as Europeans first misconstrued Romale as hailing from Misr, Egypt. During the 1971 World Romani Congress, the first to ever take place, the usage of any exonym in reference to Romale, including the G slur, was voted against. Going forward, I will be referring to this term as the G slur or the G word. And in any literature quotation wherein I insert Romale, etc. within square brackets, assume that I'm substituting the G word. Before we go on, it's important to bring up that Romani people are very frequently conflated with other communities such as the Ashkali, Balkan Egyptians, Dom, Irish travelers, the Yanish, and many others, including Dalit. Ashkali and Balkan Egyptians in Kosovo, for example, while not being considered Gadje, non-Roma, by the Romani, generally reject being classified as Romani, though some Ashkali speak Roman Lichib. The Doma are a drummer and traveling musician and dancer class, still residing in India as the Dom. Their title even stems from the Sanskrit Damaro, for drum. Since British colonial India to now, these people are considered Dalit in India, people who used to be called untouchables, the lowest castes of society. We can see that in the words of the British Raj, rest in peace, who had called them a criminal tribe. The Dom caste, while thought to be the origins of Romale, as in who Romale likely were prior to Exodus, Doma is even thought to be where the term Roma comes from, is not, in our modern understanding, a Romani people. The Dom group, speakers of Domari, are descendants of the Dom caste who left India before the Romale and migrated onward to Swana, notably Jordan and Palestine, and are often conflated with Romale and suffer from anti-Romani sentiments, but are also not self-identified as Romani. Irish travelers practice a nomadic lifestyle very similar to traditional Romani people, but are not genetically related to Romale. They have their own language too, called Shelta, unrelated to Roman Lichib, though some Romani words have been incorporated over the years. Finally, the Yanish are a distinct, historically nomadic group residing across northwestern mainland Europe, most notably in Germany and Switzerland. The term traveler was often applied by Gadje Europeans to Sinti, Roma, and Yanish. And while the Yanish are not genetically Romani, they have historically faced similar, if not the same, persecution as Romani communities. In terms of what may be dubbed quote-unquote Romani proper, we can break them down into broad but still diverse and often overlapping groups thusly. Roma, Balkan and Central and Eastern European Romale. Sinti, Northwestern European as well as French and Northern Italian. Calais of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. Calais of Finland and Wales. Manouche, French as well as Piedmontese Sinti. Romani Chal, English and otherwise United Kingdom Romani. Lom, Armenian and Caucasian Romani. Zargari of the Zargar village within the Bashariat Sharqi Dagestan of Iran. Kalbelia, a snake-charming tribe native to Thar Desert of Rajasthan, India, and who are oftentimes considered the quote-unquote original Romale, as in Romale who stayed in the Romani ancestral homeland. And many, many others, including subgroups and mixed populations. Importantly, Roma and Sinti are not interchangeable. Yes, they're both Romani communities, but they're still distinct communities. Furthermore, Roma is often used synonymously with Romani. This is technically incorrect. Roma are Romani. All Roma are Romani, but not all Romani people are Roma. I will be rectifying this conflation instead, as I have already been doing, with the usage of the term Romale, as referenced in the Calderaș English dictionary compiled by the late Romani Canadian professor and activist Ronald Lee, as well as what is the corresponding Haladitka word. Keep in mind, once again, the broadness and diversity of Roman Lichib, though. As I try to have this discussion be as streamlined as possible, I will inevitably force to omit certain nuances. I know. I'm aware. I recommend going out and doing your own supplementary research, as it will simply not be possible for this essay to be exhaustive, especially with it having a thesis and fulcrum, that being Romani coding in modern fictional and mostly fantasy literature with L. Bardugo's Grishaverse as the case study. I wanted to append some words beyond just some soulless list of trigger warnings. This will be an incredibly heavy and hefty subject to tackle, the heaviest and heftiest I have tackled to date. Everything will be timestamped for your viewing ease. We will be reading legislation and a lot of racist rhetoric. If you are non-Romani like myself, I'm not going to ask you to sit through it, but I will require it. In order to understand the part of this essay wherein I discuss modern fantasy literature, including the dog whistles therein, you need the historical context. And I know for a fact that is something a massive chunk of the non-Romani population does not have. If your reaction to seeing this video is, here we go again, here comes Sfar being a downer and killjoy as usual, argue with a wall. Don't care, didn't ask. If you intend to come at me sideways, to spew some bigoted or denialist garbage in my space, know that my trigger finger is very itchy, and you will be deleted and blocked and reported so fast. Fuck around and find out. If you are Romani, please, I beg you, take care of yourself and do not proceed with any of this content if you feel even a little bit not up to it. If you would like, you can skip directly to the part where I discuss Romale in media, particularly in the Grishaverse, but even then, don't feel like you're obliged to. You aren't. You know all of this. You don't need to hear any of it from my gadži, who is explaining it to other gadžikane. Явен са сте. The Romani people are dubbed the world's most populous marginalized community. And indeed, we would be here for days if I were to delineate every single way in which Romani people are oppressed. Instead, I will speak in broad terms on the most pertinent events in Romani history that encapsulate this people's oppression. Those key events are Romani marginalization all the way from their arrival out of Hindūstān to the current day, Romani slavery, the Samudaripen. The worldwide population of Romale is estimated between 2 to 12 million. But the François Xavier Pagnut Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University estimates as many as 15 million. Why the absurd range? A significant portion of Romale refuses to register themselves on population census due to persecution and discrimination. So, why is that? The arrival of Romale in Europe from the northern Indian homeland took place in the early to mid-1300s via Iran, Armenia, and what is the modern-day settler colony of Turkey. A second wave of Romale reached Europe in the 15th century from Iran through North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula. These two waves of Romale then converged in mainland Europe. Consciousness of Romale, or population speculated to likely be Romale, came in 800 CE Thrace in the form of the plural term Atsingani, from the Byzantine Greek Athinganos, or untouchable. Recall my reference to the Dalit caste of India. Franciscan friar Simon Fitzsimon described in his 1323 work The Journey of Simon Simeonis from Ireland to the Holy Land a people resembling Atsingani living outside of the Cretan city of Iraklio. Quote, "These people rarely or never stop in one place for more than 30 days, but always, as if cursed by God, a nomad and outcast. They wander from field to field with small, oblong, black, and low tents, like those of the Arabs, and from cave to cave, because the place inhabited by them becomes after the term of 30 days so full of vermin and other filth that it is impossible to live in the neighborhood." In that book, he also described Atsingani, who are suspected to be Romale, so I shall be referring to them as such going forward, as the descendants of Cain. You know, the Abrahamic figure often interpreted as the first murderer. Product of the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, everybody. In 1360, the fiefdom feudum Acingonorum was established in Kerkera, Greece, wherein the primary people exploited for slave labor were Romani. We will discuss the enslavement of Romale in a later subsection, which is why I am being rather brief with it here. Donald Kenrick, in his book Historical Dictionary of the Romanis, details endless atrocities Romale was subjected to in Europe since their arrival, including a 1510 order of mass execution of Romale in Switzerland, with similar legislation passing in England with the Egyptians Act 1530, in 1589 Denmark, and in 1637 Sweden, on top of endless orders of expulsions of Romani people from various European cities, from Italy to Spain to Germany to Portugal. David Crow, in A History of the Romali of Eastern Europe and Russia, describes an anti-Romani pogrom in Augsburg, Germany, instigated by the declaration of the Imperial Diet, the deliberative body of the Holy Roman Empire, that, quote, whoever kills a G-slur will be guilty of no murder. Louis XIV of France forbade the residence of Romali in France in 1660, and Portugal began deporting its Romani population to its Brazilian colony in 1685. Then, 1758 Hungary saw an introduction of programs aimed at assimilating Romale into Hungarian society, which included forceful removal of Romani children from their parents in order for them to be raised by non-Romale. Ooh, well, I've seen this movie before. Similar removal policies were adopted across Germany, whilst forced sedentarization of Romale, either via legislation and settlement laws, such as in Russia and Poland, or through outright banning of nomadism, as in Serbia, popped up systematically across Slavic countries. During the post-war period, Romani women under the Soviet Union and within other communist nations of Central and Eastern Europe were subjected to forced sterilization in order to reduce and control the Romani population. In Czechoslovakia, they were dubbed a socially degraded stratum, were called the Dalit caste of India again, and Bulgaria banned the usage of Romanlichi. You know what? Instead of rapid firing off absolute atrocities at you, let me delve a little bit deeper into Romale within my paternal and my maternal homeland, as I have a lot of information to impart apropos of that, as you can imagine, and both perfectly embody the predominating gadget attitude towards Romale. Everything is time-stamped, once again. Raul Ülker, in the 2008 assimilation of the Muslim communities in the first decade of the Turkish Republic, quoted Article 2 of the Law on Settlement 1937, or İskan Kanunu, one of several to constitute the Turkish state's policy on the forcible assimilation of non-Turkish minorities. Article 2 of İskan Kanunu reads in translation thusly: people who do not belong to Turkish culture, who are infected with syphilis, who are subject to leprosy, and their families, who are imprisoned because of committing murder except political and military reasons, anarchists, spies, Romale, and who are exiled outside of the country cannot be admitted. To quote Ülker, apparently this law linked the admission, as in to Turkey, of immigrants and refugees to the condition of affinity with Turkish culture. However, who was to be considered within this category was not specified in this law. Indeed, aside from outside Muslim Turk population, this category was referring to the non-Turk ethnic and linguistic groups, especially from the Balkans. Although this point was not cited in the original text of the Law on Settlement, another significant official text adopted in relation to this law makes the matter quite clear. This is the Memorandum of Settlement issued on August 1st, 1926. What he's referring to here is İskana ait muhtıra. A paragraph down, he writes, the immigration claims of Romale were also to be rejected. Article 5 of İskan Kanunu, Law on Settlement 1934, further stipulates that Romale of Turkish nationality ought to be settled in an appropriate region, whilst foreign Romale are to be expelled. Turkish politician Şükrü Kaya, on June 14, 1934, said at the Grand National Assembly of Turkey, "As I have observed, there are more than 1 million nomads in our country. Some are semi or permanently nomadic. There are nomads in the east, the west, and even in Adana, Antalya, Muğla, Burdur, and Isparta. Each of these people is currently in a state of suffering. They are deprived of humane, moral, national, and political education. The benefits of the Republic have not yet reached them. Among them, there are neither a judge, nor a doctor, or a teacher. It is very painful to see them being torn away and drifting from place to place like leaves caught in the wind. Shukru Kaya is one of the architects of the Armenian genocide. Gül Ateşler writes in G-Word, Stigma and Exclusion in Turkey that Romale in Turkey are known to deny the Romani heritage and flaunt Turkishness, or what's called milliyetçilik, despite Turkish Turks' frequent rejection of and Romaphobia towards Romale. Suat Kolukirik and Shule Toktaş write that some Turkish Roma go as far as claiming to be of Turkic nomad background, like Yörük Otaktacı, which is not true. Moreover, only in 1874 were Turkish Romani Muslims given the same rights as other Muslims in Turkey. Roma also do not hold the legal status of ethnic minorities in Turkey due to being primarily Muslim, despite their general treatment as social outsiders by Turkish Gacı. Because of these and innumerable other legislation impacting Romale across Turkey, as well as deeply rooted societal Romaphobia, the Romalian Romani dialect is almost extinct among Turkish Romale. This will probably be one of, if not the only, fun fact I'll auction up in this essay, but Turkish belly dance, something I grew up doing, is very much rooted in Romani cultural dance practices, similarly to flamenco in Andalusia actually. This is why I always call the dance I grew up partaking in Turkish Romani belly dance, as opposed to just Turkish belly dance, because that is simply erasive. An Arzamas article written by Nadezhda Biryukova very briefly but succinctly overviews why the connection between Russian criminal argot, called Fenya, and the Romani language was drawn up specifically in the context of the USSR, the RSFSR, and their preceding Russian Empire. There, she quotes and later presents arguments contrary to criminalist Vasily Lebedev, who, in the 1909 issue of the journal Police Bulletin, in his article titled Dictionary of the Thieves' Language, quote-unquote, observed the following regarding the Russian criminal argot Fenya. Translated quotation. Having familiarized oneself, even cursorily, with the language of our Russian criminals, it is not difficult to notice that it has a character of internationality. In particular, there are many words and expressions in it borrowed from the language of those tribes who, like the itinerant, vagabond class of professional criminals, are condemned by the will of fate to eke out a miserable existence with no fatherland, as well as to make their living among other peoples, namely Roma and Jews. Much of the quote-unquote scientific basis for the linkage of Roman Lichib and Fenya is attributable to the work of philologist and Indologist Alexei Barannikov, most notably in 1931 under the aegis of the State Institute of Speech Culture itself. Barannikov penned and published the article Romani Elements in the Russian Thieves' Argot, wherein he made the claims that over 200 such Romani chip elements are present in Fenya. And prepare yourself, because this next translated quotation is especially heinous. A significant percentage of criminals emerge from their Romani midst. Meeting in detention houses with thieves, representatives of other nationalities, Romale predominantly there, could pass on elements of their vocabulary. As you can imagine, he was soups into the idea that genetics and culture predetermine Romani crime. Very alike another infamous country's treatment of both its kidnapped slaves and subjugated indigenous peoples. So, throughout his work, Barannikov cited so-called Romani folklore and Ukrainian Romani songs which allegedly glorified theft. These supposed songs have since been concluded to most likely not even exist. Further, within the folklore which was cited by Barannikov that was actually authentic, the Moscow Institute of Anthropology and Ethnography has concluded that what's quote-unquote glorified is not theft, but barter, and a major theme in said Romani folklore is that some evildoer has stolen from a Roma the last thing they had. Recall that this Alexei Barannikov is a man whose research was endorsed by the GIRK, the State Institute of Speech Culture. For those who don't know, because honestly, why would you? The GIRK was a scientific institution focused on the field of philological sciences in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, directed by Ukrainian-born Bulgarian pan-Slavist Державин Nikolai Sevastianovich, and operating for a whopping 3 years. Good. A reference. The Institute of Anthropology and Ethnography, which debunked Barannikov, operated from 1933 to the current day, was literally formed with the express purpose of discrediting Nazi race science and is named in honor of Ukrainian-born Mykola Miklucha-Maklayev, an ethnographer and anthropological explorer who opposed blackbirding in Australia, slave labor in Kanaki and the Pacific, and the British and German colonial expansion in New Guinea. I know which institution I'd rather listen to, if I must listen to any. Romanichib linguist who taught Romanichib to himself, Viktor Shapoval, has analyzed and debunked much of Barannikov's findings apropos of Fenya's linkage to Romanichib in Power as a Lexicographer, Romani Word in the Dictionary of the Thieves' Jargon, from Volume 13 of Linguistics, Bulletin of the Ural Linguistic Society. Shapoval analyzes the terminology Barannikov put forward as evidence of Fenya's roots in Romanichib, finding instead not Romani words at all, but Latinisms, Hebraisms, and Ophanisms, borrowings from the cant of Imperial Russia's Ofenia, merchants of small items originally hailing from the village Aleksina in the Savinsky district of Ivanova Oblast. These individuals are also called Karabeniki, peddlers, hawkers, the like. Noticeable is that none of the aforementioned are related to Romale. Shapoval then goes on to detail how much of the rest of the philological reconstructions cited by Barannikov were actually falsifications, courtesy of criminologist Sergei Potapov, as published in the 1927 Jargon Dictionary, wherein the Romani words appropriated and cited had nothing to do with Russian criminal argot. Supposedly reputable sources publishing blatantly false and ideologically dangerous information about marginalized minority groups. It's almost like a couple other movies I've seen before, huh? In the book, The Story of the Roma, A Novel Outlook, co-written by late researcher of Romani culture Nikolai Bessonov with Nadezhda Demetier and Vladimir Kutenkov, Bessonov postulates that in the early 30s there was an attempt to make out of Roma kolkhozniki, communal farmers. It thus became necessitated to ideologically prime society for the idea that it would be much calmer if nomadic people were attached to the land, as in sedentarized. Naturally, this required scientific substantiation of the already existing opinion about their, the nomadic people's, utmost criminality. Academician Barannikov, an Indologist by scientific specialization, fulfilled the social order, not only in this, but in all other works apropos of Romale. We see here a continued and deliberate effort to equate Romani people to criminals, and thus marginalize and villainize a group of people which is already vulnerable and has been suffering racism and violence since time immemorial. In their essay 500 Years a Slave, Dr. Shannon Woodcock, a settler historian specializing in racism and genocide, writes on the 500-year-long slavery endured by Romale. Trigger warning for exonym usage. Between 1385 and 1848, every Romani person who entered Wallachia and Moldova, now the southern and northern parts of Romania, became a slave of the state, who could be bought and sold by the clergy or private landowners, and no Romani person could be free. Enslaved children and families could be separated for sale at any time. They were not citizens. Any free man could rape any slave woman, and if a slave was damaged through rape or physical violence, the offender had to pay compensation only to the owner. Any child born of a slave belonged to the slave master. Ethnologist and anthropologist Delia Grigori, who at least at the time, 2022, was the head of the Amare Romență Roma Center in Romania, writes in their article titled Roma Slavery from Recognition to Reconciliation as follows. According to the laws and customs of the land, Roma slaves were excluded from the condition of human beings, being in a state of dependence that was not only economic, like serfs, but especially personal and legal, the worst form of servitude encountered in human history. They were considered chattel, being exchanged, sold, given away, inherited, and subjected to abuse and violence that went as far as rape, torture, and murder by their master. The Roma family was not recognized as a community structure, but as a method of breeding slaves, akin to domesticated fowl. Slavery has also profoundly affected Roma children, who were separated from their families at the will of their masters, exchanged, given away, or sold, often at lower prices than animals, because they were not considered good enough for work. Medellin-born poet, philosopher, and democratic socialist Aimé Césaire wrote thusly in his 100-page 1950 essay, Discourse on Colonialism, about the colonial Western Europeans' outlook. His doctrine has the virtue of simplicity. The West invented science. The West alone knows how to think. At the borders of the Western world, there begins the shadowy realm of primitive thinking, which, dominated by the notion of participation, incapable of logic, is the very model of faulty thinking. Obviously, this essay is a discourse on colonialism, it's in the name, and is admittedly rather West Eurocentric and a tad reductive to the hyper-Western case, as I found being an Easterner reading the essay. However, in his description, we see encapsulated the very essence of the dominating hegemony's actions towards all entities it views as other, and a loud and clear likeness to Orientalism. The oppression and exploitation of Romani bodies was justified by the dominating entity, be that Wallachia or some such other entity in the given scenario doesn't really matter. And it was justified so by positioning Romale as parasitic outsiders, as foreigners, as dark, dirty, diseased, degenerate, and depraved invaders. We witness a very similar pattern of behavior apropos of the refugee crises experienced across the global north, not just Europe, a sort of white panic, a conspiracy theorist, frenzied consternation. It is, above all, supremacist ideology. In the words of, and hold fast now, you might be astonished to hear this citation, Edward Said, a white middle-class Westerner, believes it their human prerogative to not only manage the non-white world, but also to own it, just because by definition, it is not quite as human as we are. In the case of Romale, the Westerner, or at least the European, as Romanians stand very much at the crossroads, didn't even need to go out of their way to travel to the racialized world in order to subjugate it. The racialized world came to the European, seeking refuge, only to receive violence. And obviously, this dynamic is not exclusive to the West or Europe. We cannot ignore Japanese and Russian imperialism or the colonization perpetrated by Turks, China, India, Greece, Khaliji Arabs, or, as I've already delineated to you in detail, Romaphobia in Turkey and Russia. None of these are better or worse than Western European colonization and imperialism, because regardless of the case, it always boils down to us versus them. And, unfortunately, we were forced to witness exactly how far that ideology led. Aimé Césaire, in Discourse on Colonialism, maintains that there are sins for which no one has the power to make amends, and which can never be fully expiated. All these centuries of oppression against Romale culminated in one of the darkest events in human history. The death toll of the Holocaust, a mass genocide perpetrated by the German government from 1941 to 1945, was 17 million. The primary victims of the Nazi state were Jews, Romale, and Slavs, and while the Slavs suffered the largest losses, the Jews and Romale suffered the most targeted persecution and destruction aimed specifically at complete annihilation, what was dubbed the final solution. The Romani Holocaust is called Samudaripen, or mass killing. It is often also dubbed the Porajmos, for the devouring. However, in various dialects of Romanlichib, especially among Balkan Romale, Porajmos is considered to be too similar to the term Poravipe, or rape, which is why Samudaripen is the preferred term, as well as the one adopted by the International Romani Union. In Haladitka specifically, Kalitrash, or Black Terror, is another applicable term. Regardless of what name you choose to impart on it, the reality remains. The Romani Holocaust was a genocide of the Romani people on the basis of ethnicity. German historian Carola Fings, in her article Genocide, Holocaust, Porajmos, Samudaripen, writes, "The persecution of Roma under National Socialism, Nazism, was a genocide. This statement is important because a genocide fundamentally differs from other forms of persecution. A genocide aims to obliterate an entire group that the majority society defines as an enemy. Roma, like Jews, were stigmatized as an alien race, and it was decided to eliminate them permanently from society. It was achieved initially through social, economic, and spatial isolation. In the shadow of the Second World War, physical extermination ultimately became the priority. The victims were selected not because of their individual behavior, but solely because they belonged to the minority. Children, women, and men were threatened in life and limb because they were classified as G-slurs. It did not matter whether they were poor or rich, assimilated or unassimilated, young or old, fair or dark-skinned. Whole families were systematically registered, deported, and murdered. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum estimates the number of Romani victims of the Holocaust to be anywhere between 250,000 and 500,000. Polish-American political scientist Zbigniew Brzezinski postulated the death toll of the Romani to reach 800,000, while Romani scholar and political advocate Ian Francis Hancock, Romani name Jan Kolereciosko, makes an estimate of potentially as many as 1.5 million. And that is what we know. This number could be even bigger because, again, historically and to this day, Romale often refuse to register as Romani on population census, and you can fucking understand why. Samudaripen Memorial Day is August 2nd of every year. Prior to all that, the Kingdom of Bavaria, in particular, had developed a rigorous race-based system for the policing of Romale, so much so that in 1899, München had a central office for G-word affairs, devoted to the surveillance of Romani people, including information gathering, and July 1926 saw the enactment of the law for the combating of G-words, travelers, and the work-shy, which would inevitably also include the Yenish and other itinerant peoples. This is where supremacist ideology leads. Death, destruction, horror, trauma, and violence in its most barbaric. To quote Aimé Césaire for the final time, whether one likes it or not, at the end of the blind alley that is Europe, I mean the Europe of Adorno, Schumann, Bedolt, and a few others, there is Hitler. At the end of capitalism, which is eager to outlive its day, there is Hitler. At the end of formal humanism and philosophic renunciation, there is Hitler. Without him being aware of it, he has a Hitler inside him. Hitler inhabits him. Hitler is his demon. And if he rails against him, he's being inconsistent. And so, at bottom, what he cannot forgive Hitler for is not the crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of a man as such. It is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that Hitler applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs, the Indians, and the Africans. That was admittedly a very lengthy preamble just to get to the part where we talk about Romale in fiction. And this isn't even where we discuss El Bardugo. To make this section at least a tiny bit more bite-sized and digestible, I'm going to give you two, but technically one, brief examples of the prevailing anti-Romani narratives in fictional literature and storytelling. I will not be going into a deep discussion of Romani culture, that is not my place, nor is it my purpose or thesis. I will bring it up chiefly as needed, but if you want to genuinely engage with cultural knowledge of Romale, much of which, I will warn you, is closed practice, you can seek that from own voices sources elsewhere. I am a bitch on the internet. Let me quickly run you through some basic Romani stereotypes you see in media. The fortune teller. Tarot was not invented by Romale, nor is it exclusive, but fortune telling, by and large, was a profession popularized and established by Romale due to societal stratification, placing Romani people as so low a caste, even outside of caste societies. While very culturally significant and often a closed practice, like essentially all of Romani culture, fortune-telling was still largely a profession of necessity due to discrimination, especially for Romnia, Romani women, and was still criminalized. we see very frivolous throwing around of very Romani tarot in media such as Gothicana by Runix, a book wherein the main character is absolutely not alluded to being Romani despite very questionable fan art, and which already has a lot of racist undertones, like its sole black character being a curvy mean girl who is apparently a bitch because she suffered sexual violence at an orphanage. But I digress. Thus, the fortune teller archetype is now an anti-Romani, Romaphobic racial caricature of a dishonest cheat, a swindler, a liar. This stereotype is then grafted onto the population at large, and we all know what follows after. Witchcraft. The concept of Romale being witches or somehow involved in the occult is a racist stereotype. Romale are normal people. Once again, I genuinely don't think a lot of you believe or realize that about people outside of the West especially. Kidnappers. It has been a long prevailing false accusation that Romale abduct babies and children, by which is obviously meant non-Romani, non-racialized children specifically. This was used largely as a fear-mongering tactic against the practice of nomadism, as well as a justification for the expulsion of and pogroms against Romale. This stereotype bears certain resemblance to blood libel, and also manifests in the stereotype that exists of Romale supposedly being child traffickers, when Romani people, children in particular, are the most vulnerable to trafficking. I don't think folks know how trafficking actually works. H.D. Carlton. The thief. Due to a history of some of the most extreme marginalization, Romale were historically forced into pickpocketing and petty crime in order to merely survive in racist, casteist, classist societies. Naturally, this will be weaponized against them by their oppressors. Romale have been stereotyped as criminals, beggars, the impoverished, and therefore criminals once over throughout a classist and racist history. I assume I don't need to unpack that for you syllable by syllable. The sexually promiscuous Romani woman. Just as across colonization events and throughout the history of Orientalism, the exotification and sexualization of Romani women has led to direct, deeply rooted violence. From the rape of Romale during Wallachian slavery, to sex trafficking, to fetishism and sexual abuse. The Romani woman's mysterious nature is quoted in shallow justification, generally linkable to their stereotyped nomadic lifestyle, which is not universal to Romali in the modern day, might I add, and Romali were historically forced into nomadism due to all the aforediscussed marginalization, or on account of the Romani woman's dark features, or dark skin. As brought up in my previous anti-Orientalist essay, sexualization in the oppressor-oppressed and colonizer-colonized dynamic is inherently linked to violence, which is why the concept of sexual liberation is not universal in its appearance and can never be applied on a broad stroke. And I mean, how many times have you seen a sexy fortune teller Halloween costume worn by both white and non-white kajikane? That is just dressing up as a racial caricature, and yet it's not taken seriously in the slightest as an act of racism. This Orientalist mysticization of and fascination with Romani culture, Romani women most of all, has also resulted in the creation of a lot of artworks with Romani subjects. It is thus also an act of commodification of marginalized bodies that have historically been forced into slavery. Finally, at least for now, Romale as being nomadic performers, be that in circus, theater, dance, song, or what have you. Yes, that is a historical aspect of Romani culture. Take the Romən Theatre, a Romani theater in Moscow up until 2021, directed by Russian Romani singer and actor Nikolai Slichenko. Once again, though, much of Romani performance culture was largely developed out of necessity, and this lifestyle is no longer universal on top of all that, once more owing to sedentarization laws. No matter what Romale did, it was always wrong, because that's the modus operandi of the oppressor. These days, the caricaturized iconography of the wandering Romani performer is just another stereotype to plaster onto Romale to exotify and mysticize them. Keep in mind that all that I just brought up was weaponized as propaganda, fear-mongering, and ethnic discrimination during the Samudaripen Romani Holocaust. These are not silly, preconceived notions. They carry deep historical harm. Now, onto media. Finally, a man. While you might know The Hunchback of Notre-Dame as the whimsical but kind of terrifying Disney cartoon, it was originally an 1831 Gothic novel by French author Victor Hugo, and it was bad. Wikipedia extols it as the first novel to have beggars as protagonists, which I honestly call palavra, seeing as that in parliamentary language there's simply no way, but I digress. The book is pretty different from the cartoon and far more messed up, but what matters is Esmeralda is still there as she's in the cartoon. Except she's not. See, what we find out at the end of Vicky Hughes' bookie book here is that Esmeralda was kidnapped by Romale and was therefore not a Romani at all, but a French child born Agnes. She was also 16, but that's neither here nor there. It is also revealed at the end of the novel that Quasimodo was the Romani child who was left behind, and in whose place Esmeralda was abducted. Since I assume no one here was comatose when I ran over the basic anti-Romani tropes in media, I'm likewise assuming that we see the problem. Here, we have not just the century-old trope of the Roma who kidnaps a non-Romani child, thus positioning Romale as some devious criminals, but also the idea that a Romani parent would abandon their actual child. If we piece 2 and 2 together, and I know we can because we're smarts, this was one of the justifications for the removal of Romani children from their Romani families during the 500-year-long enslavement of Romale in Romania. The false idea that Romani people, Romani mothers in particular, did not have quote-unquote paternal/motherly instincts. If you need an analogy, it was also the reason why children were removed from indigenous families in the Americas. White women believed themselves to be better suited for motherhood than racialized women, partly because motherhood was equated to femininity, and femininity was only permitted to white women. First of all, just to get it out of the way, Disney has a history of violent racism and is currently under boycott for the support and essential endorsement of Israel. Look up the Marvel quote-unquote hero Sabra, and then look into the Sabra and Shatila massacre. That's all I have to say. So, the representation of Romani people and Esmeralda, who actually is Romani here, in The Hunchback of Notre-Dame of Disney has been controversial and precarious since this movie's release. I won't commentate on the more nuanced aspect of this representation as, once again, it's not my place, but instead direct you here for Romani insight on it, as well as urge you to do your own honest research, as a people is not a monolith and you cannot take an individual for a spokesperson. That's literally an act of racism. I will commentate on, however, the aspects of this movie that are indisputably an issue, namely being the depiction of the Romani masses throughout the film. Observe. This is a cartoon. Duh, spectacular scholarly observation. As an artist myself, I know the power of semi-realistic illustration style, and what you're seeing here are century-old racial caricatures, from the weak chins to the oversized noses to the generally unpretty depictions of these largely Swadia people. Look at how Esmeralda is illustrated. Gorgeous, genuinely the prettiest Disney face, but with that comes a problem. No other Romani person is illustrated to look anything like her. She's even drawn with light eyes, unlike every other Roma around her who is black-eyed. It's almost a one of the good ones trope all over again, the "you're pretty for a brown girl" line. While Romali are extremely diverse in phenotype, this depiction is still very weird when contextualized. Further, while Esmeralda is definitely not sexually promiscuous in her portrayal, her character is nevertheless designed to appeal to that stereotype. The cleavage, the sheer material, the always exposed shoulders. With the history of Romani subjugation, of the rape of Romani women and girls, and men and boys, of sex trafficking, which Romali are not usually the perpetrators of, but the victims of, this depiction is a form of violence. Once again, the concept of sexual liberation does not have the same look universally. Historically sexualized, sexually exploited, and sexually violated people, a people whose culture leans towards modest to boot, will never be liberated through sexualization like this, especially considering this cartoon was not made by Romale. And finally for this section, Quasimodo is whitewashed. In the original book, racist garbage as it was made explicit that Quasi was Romani, and while the cartoon definitely fixed a bunch of issues, even I'll admit that, there was no reason for Quasi to be a pale green-eyed ginger. We literally saw his dark-featured parents. Yes, genetics work strangely, especially when ginger hair is concerned. I'm a scientist by profession, I know that. However, in context, this comes off as a very charged choice by Disney. That's sort of their MO. Here, we finally arrive at Lee Bardugo's Sully. Aren't you so glad we traveled all this way? Let's peruse the fan wiki page to learn more. I know this isn't exactly academic scholarship, but it absolutely offers a glimpse into the mind of the fans of these works. Here's a description of the Sully culture, verbatim quotation. The Sully are a close people who are loyal to each other and wary of strangers. Because they are travelers and have no land, home to the Sully simply means family. The Sully do not recognize any kings. Sully belief holds that their ancestors will welcome them in the next world. Some Sully believe in saints. Many Sully are carnival performers and fortune tellers, though some have joined the second army and others take on seasonal work. How familiar of a description! Let's break that down sentence by sentence. The Sully are a close people who are loyal to each other and wary of strangers. Romani culture is notoriously closed, and a lot of Roma are wary of Nanэ, for all the reasons I outlined previously. Not necessarily the worst sentence ever written. Because they are travelers and have no land, home to the Sully simply means family. Now, the first clause of that sentence is worded really weirdly, and it's obvious that the writer is applying a very un-indigenous framework to the concept of land ownership on top of this strange verbiage. However, I'm not going to explain to you said concept of land ownership of the Romani people. That's not my place and not the point of this essay. The Sully do not recognize any kings. That's neither here nor there for our context. I simply cannot go into that here. Sully belief holds that their ancestors will welcome them in the next world. Romale have a very deep and important relationship with ancestors. A lot of Roma I personally know engage in ancestral worship. I also do, but obviously not Romani ancestral worship. Some Sully believe in saints. This is a big giveaway. Prior to Exodus, Romale practiced Shaktism, a denomination of Hinduism, particularly the worship of Kali, the goddess of time, the life cycle, power, and destruction, in as simple of a term as can be afforded. Due to persecution the Romani people experienced in Europe in particular, most Romale underwent Christianization for, as we've discussed, survival. However, the Kali of Shaktism was in a sense hidden in who became the Roman Catholic patron saint of the Romani people, Saint Sara Kali, Sara the Black. For analogies, think the Afro-Brazilian diasporic religion Candomblé, how the Yoruba Orisha therein were disguised behind Roman Catholic saints, or the way many indigenous Anatolians like Armenians, Assyrians, and Greek speakers hid their Christian praxis behind Islamic effigies during the genocides in the Ottoman Empire and moving forward in Turkish history, crypto-Christians as the phenomenon is now known. It is an act of survival. Here's the final sentence of that fan wiki paragraph. Many Sully are carnival performers and fortune tellers, though some have joined the second army and others take on seasonal work. Ignoring the second army part for obvious reasons, this is word for word a parallel of Romale. In fact, remember how I said that one of the theories for the Romani exodus from Hindūstān was the invasion of northern India by Mahmud of Ghazni? Well, in one sub-theory if you want, Romale were thought to be soldiers who fought against Mahmud of Ghazni, contributing to their exodus. On top of that, the language as well as another title of the Ruska Roma, Russian Romani, is, as I've been saying, Haladitka. You know what that means? Soldiers. Let's read more of the fan wiki now. The Sully, being a nomadic stateless people, may have been influenced by Romani culture. May. Sure. The physical appearance of Sully, however, appear to have a South Asian influence. However, what does that mean? Romale are South Asian. This is just blatant ignorance and absence of research. In particular, Suli performance seems to have drawn inspiration from the Bhavai theatre, from practices in Gujarat, while the names of known characters resemble Persian and Arabic. As nomads who traveled through Russia-influenced Ravka, the Suli can be associated with Turkic peoples of Middle Asia, and more specifically the Tatars, who are partially Christianized, which is similar to Inej and her family worshipping Ravkan saints. A lot wrong with this. First of all, as someone who is admittedly small, part Turkic, let me tell you that there is nothing Turkic about the Suli. The pinnacle of nomadic Turkic culture is horse riding, steppes, and the Ak and Gara, or what you might know as a yurt. I mean, for fuck's sake, the Suli read fortune with coffee dregs, which emerged strongly during Ottoman times as Qira'at al-Finjan, Surji Gusha Kutun, Fal Kahve, and Kahve Falı, among other titles, and is also intimately linked to Romani culture. Turks are a tea people. Secondly, theater, circus, all the performing arts are, once again, historically intrinsic to Romani life, due to that usually having been the only place where they were allowed to work due to the worst discrimination a population could possibly experience. Ravka is also not quote-unquote Russia-influenced, it's just Russia-influenced, and Ruska Roma are widespread across all of Russian territory, both native and colonized, all the way to the Kamchatka Peninsula and even into China. This is interesting because the Suli in the Grishaverse are also known to live in Shuhan, a country inspired by China and Mongolia. And finally, we've already discussed the Christianization of Romale, most notably Saint Sara and Kalyi. Ruska Roma are overwhelmingly Oriental Orthodox. For comparison, Tatars, including those of Russia, are predominantly what? Sunni. Sunni Muslim, yeah. Tatarstan, the epicenter of the Tatar population of Russia, is over 50% Muslim. Only 30% of Tatarstan's population is Oriental Russian Orthodox. Kazan, the capital of Tatarstan, is most well known for its Qal Sharif Masjid, a Sunni mosque. But, once again, because God's forbid a bitch talks, I digress. Editing Sfar, cut that out. No, I don't know how. The end of this specific fan wiki quotation reads, "There, Suli, circuses with tightrope walking resemble Byzantine, located on the territory of modern Turkey, circuses with foreign Asian acrobats of various origins. Later, other elements of Byzantine culture succeeded in Russia." Palavra. As we've discussed, circus performance is central to much of Romani culture. What do you think said Byzantine circuses were? The mistreatment of the Suli is possibly an echo of their basis on Romani culture. Yeah, there is so much blatant erasure in this article and in all of the Grishaverse fandom and by proxy books. But here's what's especially offensive in this article specifically. Quotes from the trivia section. In Turkic languages, the word Suli means oat. Yes, Proto-Turkic Suli does mean oat, which is reflected in a lot of modern Turkic descendants such as Turkmen Süle, Uzbek Suli, and even Kalmyk Sul. However, irrelevant. Again, nothing Turkic about this case. Nomadism does not a Turk make. In Baltic languages, Suli comes from the Russian zhulik, which means a rascal. It actually doesn't. It means swindler, cheat, card sharp, petty thief. Also, what is wrong with you? Who the fuck wrote this? Because if that's where this word came from, that's so racist, oh my god. Also, the cited Suli in Baltic languages does seem to refer to the Estonian Suli, which is, I believe, a colloquial descendant of the Russian zhulik. Further on that note, there is the Russian shuler, specifically for card shop, a cognate of the Polish schuler, which was borrowed from the Czech shulir, and also exists in Romanian as shuler, as well as Armenian, Georgian, and other languages influenced by Russian through colonial expansion. The Russian zhulik, in turn, likely arrived through the Tatar sölek from the Proto-Turkic sül, for leech. None of these, however, are Baltic. I don't know why Baltic languages was highlighted when the existence of that word within seemingly one, though do correct me if more, Baltic language is through so roundabout a means, with the Suli language in the Grishaverse also not bearing any resemblance to any Baltic language. I guess this is just me thinking, which is never a good idea, I've found. To carry on, lest we forget our destination. In Hindi, suli means cross or gallows. It means stake or crucifix, i.e. a cross, especially in the context of Christianity, and gallows is not grammatically correct. It's always gallows in reference to the execution method. Gallows is an obsolete English word meaning to terrify. In Kannada language, why is it called Kannada language? It's just Kannada, whatever, thinking again. In Kannada language, the word suli means wonder. So it appears to mean whirlpool. Okay, let's move on. Here's how the fan wiki page on the Suli language describes it. Although the Suli people are based partly on the Romani and various South Asian cultures, so now it is based on Romale. Good. The real-world inspiration for the Suli language is unclear. Few Suli words are known in the Grishaverse, making it difficult to find derivations for words and similarities between Suli and Romani and other South Asian languages. In Shadow and Bone, the Suli dialect is very similar to real-world Croatian. The Suli words in Shadow and Bone translate directly the same way from English to Croatian. However, the Suli in Six of Crows and the Rule of Wolves no longer maintains this similarity. This all indicates a lack of consistency and an author's general disinterest, which, if you recall my words in my previous video on advice apropos of writing Orientalized cultures and people, is a sign that you should not be writing about a culture or people. We even see obscure details, like that the Suli often find shelter in caves. That harkens back to aforementioned Franciscan friar Simon Fitzsimmons' racist recount of Atsingani, Romale, let's be honest, in his journey of Simon Simeonis from Ireland to the Holy Land, that they, Romale, as if cursed by God, are nomad and outcast. After the 30th day, they wander from field to field with low tents and from cave to cave. These are things the fandom has noticed. That's why they're listed in the wikis. From the persecution of Suli across El Bardugo's world, to their reverence for Afghan saints, to their nomadism with caravans, clearly referencing the Romani Chalvardo, fortune-telling circus performance, to the land ownership laws enacted against them, very reminiscent of the USSR's against Romale, to the Germano-Nordic coded nation Fjerda's discrimination against the Suli for their stereotyped connection to witchcraft and being quote-unquote cursed, as if Fjerde is some 1940s Germany knockoff and we're still supposed to empathize with Matthias like some one of the good ones bullshit, only grown and changed after he kissy-kissed a witch because God forbid the Übermensch learns to see marginalized people as humans without having to get his dick hard to one of them first. Rest in peace, actually. This is not some accidental coding. Bardugo did not trip and fall into such an obviously Romani portrayal of her fictional ethnicity. Romani culture, history, and people is very obviously where this author got her inspiration, and yet the Grishaverse fandom seems not privy to this. I recognize the coding immediately because I, again, grew up around Ruska Roma. Not a lot of people can say that in English, especially given how Anglo-catered the Grishaverse franchise is. Everything is made palatable. All edges are sanded down, all nuance glossed into something shiny and easy to swallow, and that is what makes it so reprehensible. You're taking the objectively most marginalized people in the world, and you are diluting them and allowing your audience to speculate in vague verbiage, in the process erasing and obscuring a real oppressed culture and people. Even with the Suli character of Inej, what do you really know of the Suli? Before you commence this essay, what did you really know of Romale? Did you know the truth of the G-word? Did you know about the 500-year-long slavery of a people? Did you know that the final solution extended beyond Jewish Europeans? And why did you need a Gentile Gaji to tell you any of it? With that, I leave you. This was far from anarchy on page, and this was the longest and most difficult video I've ever had to make. It was edited in 7 separate parts because I wasn't going to have my program crashing on me like what happened with my anti-Swana Orientalist video all over again. I decided to make myself troll through Republic-era Turkish legislation for, in the grand scheme, an iota of this runtime. I had to translate fucking Shukru Kaya, literally what is bro yapping about. But I cannot say this wasn't one of the most important things I've ever written, because it absolutely was. Written essay form, including all the sources and untranslated quotations, are below Substack. From Archive, International Roma Union, Ergo Network, and other organizations for Romani civil rights, including the aforementioned European Roma Rights Center, will be linked below in a card. All of my links, including my books, art, Substack, Coffee, Instagram, Goodreads, and Storygraph, etc., are also in the description as usual. Like, share, subscribe, generally interact with this video. I have no idea if YouTube is going to bury it due to the subject matter, so I'd really appreciate some communal help. This is anarchy on page after all. Tejaven Bachtale to the Romale who may have stumbled across this video and watched through to the end. Apologies that I only know a few Haladitka phrases, but feel free to talk to me in Russian if you want. I'll try to make my next publication a little lighter on the runtime for everyone's sake, most of all mine. I finished reading all the poetry collections I've had in my backlog, so I'll perhaps make a video about that next. Whatever the future holds, one thing is certain, it just won't be the same. Or whatever Dostoevsky said.